Andrew's a secondary school teacher, and many of you will already know him. He's been to the festival many times before. He's a secondary school teacher turned author, podcaster, and filmmaker. He runs the immensely useful Cycling Europe website. He's got a podcast of the same name, and he's written 3 very popular books about his travels across Europe. He's also one of our most popular speakers, and he's a lovely guy. So, Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I suppose it's quite a privilege to be the first person up on the festival. So thank you for the invitation. And on behalf of all the speakers and also everybody who is tuning in, listening tonight, then thank you for organising it, Laura and Tim. I know that, you know, an immense amount of work goes into the whole thing. So thank you on behalf of everybody who actually benefits. Now, I've only got about 15-20 minutes, so this is relatively short compared to perhaps how long we normally speak at the festival. I've met many of you before, and it was quite interesting just looking on the people signing into the chat there. Lots of names that I recognise. So hello to everybody, whether I know you or not. Now, my plan for 2020 was to cycle the length of Japan. The plan was to fly to Tokyo and then take the bike on another plane up to the northernmost point, Cape Sawyer, and then cycle on my new bike. I bought a new bike to replace Reggie, called Wanda, cycle back down to Tokyo, taking a few days of the Olympics, and then to continue all the way to the southernmost point of Japan, which was Cape Sato, fly back to Tokyo, and then fly back home. Now that clearly didn't happen for obvious reasons. Who knows what will happen in the future, whether it will happen in 2021 or in the future, I really don't know. But the problem was that my appetite for doing something had been whetted. So I was left thinking, well, what can I do during the summer of 2020? My inspiration came via this book. It was one of my tasks during lockdown to read this book again. It had been given to me when I left my job in 2014 by my colleagues before I set off to cycle from Tarifa to Nordkap, that many of you might have read about in the book that I wrote. But this book was written by a chap about 100 years ago. It was called Travelling Light, or Cycling Europe on 50 cents a day. It was written by a chap called Maximilian J. St. George, and his journey in 1908 and 1909 took him on that route around Europe. He was an American, and it's an interesting read. He cycled about 16,000 miles altogether on that rather, well, seemingly crazy route all around Europe. One of the other things I did during lockdown is actually I made a podcast about that. And if you look out for episode 21 of the Cycling Europe podcast, you can actually listen to a lot of information about that journey and also cycling in Europe at the time. But in the foreword to his book, the person writing the foreword points out that Maximilian cycled to almost every capital city of Europe of his day, with the exception of Lisbon and Petrograd, which was the capital of Russia, or the Russian Empire, modern day St. Petersburg. And it got me thinking. At the time I thought, well, I wonder what a route would look like if you tried to take in all the capital cities of modern day Europe, which is a bit more tricky. And this is what I came up with, rather crazy route, starting at my home and finishing in Paris. It would take a heck of a long time if you did it in one continuous journey. But actually, Maximilian himself, at the end of his book, he does address how you could possibly tackle such a journey. And I'm going to read from what you can see on the screen here. He says, such a trip is not so remarkable that anyone cannot make it. To stretch it out for 16 months over all of Europe on $250, however, one must be able to speak at least 6 of the principal languages and have a large amount of patience, perseverance, and endurance. Patience above all. Well, I'm a languages teacher, so at least I had a little bit of the language skills, and now I spend most of my time doing supply teaching, so I probably have patience, perseverance, and endurance in bucket loads. but he continued. But this trip could be divided into periods of 3 months. One trip could take up the British Isles, another Belgium, Holland and northern France, a third Scandinavia, a fourth Germany, Austria and Switzerland, a fifth France and Spain, a sixth Italy. Anyone during the vacation months could take one of these 6 trips mentioned. It can be done cheaply, and it is the only way of really seeing Europe. That was about a journey that took place at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, why not also in the 21st century? And he identifies the British Isles. One trip could take up the British Isles, and it was from that I took my inspiration. I thought, well, perhaps that's where I should head in 2020 instead. Obviously, Dublin would be out of the question, but I came up with the idea of the Great British Cycle Tour, channeling. I've been spending years fighting Brexit. Perhaps it was now time to embrace Brexit and stick to cycling within the UK for at least 1 year. And this is the route that I took. The basic plan was to cycle from my home in Yorkshire up to Edinburgh, then Belfast, then Cardiff, and then finally down to London. It was split into 4 parts. I set off from where I live, Halifax. It wasn't a direct route by any stretch of the imagination. As you can see there, I kind of went into the Lake District. It was a route that was chosen really because it was hopefully a bit more interesting. And I wasn't 100% certain that when I arrived in Edinburgh, I would continue, but I did. Obviously, the next destination was Belfast. This was part 2. The weather was terrible as I left Edinburgh, and I had a few technical issues as I headed to Belfast, but I caught the ferry. I could, I suppose, just have turned round and headed straight back to the mainland, but it seemed a good opportunity to do a little bit of cycling in Northern Ireland, and I went up the Antrim coast like that. And then after having got back to Belfast, I returned to the mainland, to Liverpool. Now, at this point, the weather hadn't been brilliant, as I mentioned, so I headed back to Halifax and spent a few weeks watching for hopefully for the weather to improve. I then headed back to Liverpool and eventually took a route that took me across Wales on the Lon Las Cymru cycle route all the way down to Cardiff. And from there, the final stretch was a fairly familiar route. I used to live in Reading, so it wasn't outside my comfort zone to cycle from Cardiff to London via Bath and Reading, like I mentioned. And that was the end of the trip to the 4 capitals of the UK. However, the big question was COVID. Cycling from Yorkshire to Edinburgh to Belfast to Cardiff to London in itself wasn't the challenge. The potential challenge would be doing it in the time of COVID. And the main impact that it had on the trip was in terms of the accommodation. Normally, when I set off on my cycles, I kind of set off with the intention, initially at least, of camping as much as I can. But that really was quite tricky because a lot of the campsites were not accepting people once they got to their strict limit of people. Usually you can turn up on a bike and just expect to be let in. They'll always find a corner for you. But that wasn't the case in 2020. I did do a lot of camping, 15 nights as you can see, but it did require a lot more planning, especially in that first part and then through Wales, than I would normally expect to do. Also stayed in a few hotels. I'd normally do that if I'm in a big city or the weather was bad, and that was how it turned out on this trip as well. Stayed with 3 friends in Dunbar, in Dunragit in Scotland, and then back down in Reading. A couple of warm showers people in northern Wales, and that was interesting because with warm showers, obviously you're visiting people in their homes, and although the restrictions had been lifted for people traveling and people staying with other people, I think quite a few people were still quite reluctant, but the people I did stay with, Joe and Kath in Carnarvon, they were both quite happy about me coming into their house and sharing their house overnight. So that was quite useful. And then the final 2 nights, or 2 nights when I got back into England, were at the youth hostels in Bath and in London. So in terms of the makeup of accommodation, it wasn't massively different from what I've normally done in the past, but it did require just a bit more planning than usual. Now I'm going to pick out a few highlights. That picture was taken near Bolton Abbey, which is nowhere near Lancashire, but in Skipton, or near Skipton in the Yorkshire Dales. I suppose when I arrived at Bolton Abbey at the campsite at Catgill Farm, I was quite curious as to how the whole thing would work under COVID, but fundamentally camping is camping and it didn't change that much. What did change was in the communal areas. Obviously, everything was very strict. There were limitations on the number of people who could go into the buildings. They were very keen on cleanliness and that kind of things. But apart from that, camping was still okay, although it did require, probably for the majority of the campsites, to have booked in advance. This trip also gave me an opportunity of meeting with some people who I'd got to know over the last few years. Rob Ainsley, he's actually giving a talk on, I think it's on Monday night, I've written it down, Monday at 8 p.m. He's actually given a talk at the festival about some of his rivers routes where he follows a river. So I got the chance to meet up with Rob. He also helped me record one of the podcasts that you can find if you go online. He also guided me through the Yorkshire Dales, which is quite useful. That said, this was fairly familiar territory for me. I first went there back in 2009 on my very first long distance cycle route. You can see there with the bicycle, the bicycle I had at the time, and that was taken at exactly the same spot. And you can see they haven't even bothered repairing the fence in 11 years. So yeah, I make no comment. Now, this was a real highlight of the trip. Winshield's Farm campsite was up in Northumberland, near a town called Haltwhistle, which is self-styled as the centre of Britain. And if you go onto TripAdvisor, you'll find some fairly dodgy reviews for Winshield's Farm campsite. And it's because Malcolm, and that's why I've put his name there, only took over running the place a couple of years ago. And the reviews date from a previous owner. He runs a fantastic site. And if you ever find yourself in that part of the world, and if you ever find yourself wanting to go and explore Hadrian's Wall, then go to Winshield's Farm campsite, because it's a great place. And you can see there, that was the view from my tent. Stayed there 2 nights and went exploring Hadrian's Wall on my day off. So top tip, go to Winshield's Farm campsite. And then heading into Scotland, this is probably one of the highlights, if not the highlight of that first part of the entire trip, the coastline north of Berwick. This is the picture from St Abb's Head in Scotland. Just look at that, that's amazing. You could, if you're teaching geography to your children in homeschooling lessons, you could probably use that picture to fill at least one, if not many lessons. Look at the geography of all those folded rock formations, fantastic. And then I arrived in Edinburgh and made the decision to continue. Now the problem, as I alluded to earlier, leaving Edinburgh, was the fact that it was an extremely wet day. I think it was probably one of the wettest days I've ever experienced on a bike, but when you're wet, you're wet. So it was just a case of keeping going, mainly on the canals, and then south of Glasgow, making my way towards the coast. I eventually cycled about 190 kilometres on that particular day, eventually diving into a hotel near Prestwick Airport. My phone also gave up the ghost, or nearly gave up the ghost. I could only use it very sporadically, but I did manage to take this picture. You don't see many of these in Britain, not cows, but signs for the Eurovelo routes. And it's probably worth just pointing out or reminding people that the Eurovelo routes stretch as far as Britain. So if you're planning a route that perhaps is going to stretch into the future, you could at least start in 2021 by following a Eurovelo route. You've got number 1, which is the Atlantic coast route that starts down in Portugal and goes as far as Nordkap. The Capitals route that will take you all the way as far as Moscow, should you choose. The North Sea Cycle route, number 12, which does as it says on the tin, really. And the Via Romea Francigena, which is the one I actually followed back in 2010, but it actually starts in London and takes you through the fields of Kent. So you can, if you wanted, perhaps you're planning something on the continent, you can start at least in Britain in 2021 and head off further afield. And the trip that I did last year, I bumped into the Eurovelo 1 quite a lot, which was quite nice. I eventually made it to Belfast, repaired my phone. Belfast is not the prettiest of cities, but for somebody who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, on a political level, in terms of political history, I found it a fascinating place to visit. But the real highlight of Northern Ireland was the Antrim coast. And you can see here, cycling north along the coast. You can see why they chose to film Game of Thrones there. Spectacular scenery. And obviously the further north you get to the Giant's Causeway. Another delight about Northern Ireland, and completely unexpected, was the town of Portrush. This was the beach at Portrush, and it had a lot of money thrown at it because of the open golf, being there a couple of years ago. But just look at that beautiful, beautiful scene. The beach and the sea are not too bad either, but that's Wander, my Koga bike. Highly recommended. Now, back to the route. The next stop was Liverpool. However, the weather didn't look too brilliant, so I decided to head back home. I was actually home for 3 weeks, and I did take up sketching. I just want to point out that I do not keep my bike in my front room, but I think I might have repaired it actually that day and decided to sketch it, which is not bad. The handlebars are tricky, but there we go. And then towards the end of August, I think it was the final week of August, set off again, and it looked like my luck was in with the weather. It looked like finally the weather had turned, and that was the scene at Liverpool waterfront with the weather. Unfortunately, well, this was about to happen.
Another batch of wet, windy for the time of year, you could almost say wild weather is on the way. This time thanks to Storm Francis, named by the Met Office on Monday morning. There are warnings in force. We'll deal with those in just a moment. First of all, let's take a look at the bigger picture. For many, Monday was the calm before the storm. Some sunshine in places, but this large mass of cloud, that is the storm forming during Monday and approaching the UK. It's intensifying. Number of isobars around it increasing, the winds picking up as that storm approaches, and these weather fronts will be bringing bands of rain.
I'm not sure if you can actually hear what he's saying, but he's talking about the storm approaching Wales.
Northwards. Heavy showers ahead of that system across parts of eastern England for a time, but the weather fronts take over and most places become pretty soggy by Tuesday morning. Some clearer skies across northern Scotland.
The problem was that as I headed into Llandudno, heading west, the storm was heading east, and it made the storms and the wetness of Scotland look like a toddler's party. It was extremely wet and extremely windy. So it was a relief to get to Anglesey and to actually spend a day just cycling around southeastern Anglesey for a day to dry off and recover from the storm. Now, as I said, I followed the Long Las Cymru, which is a fantastic route. I'm sure many people listening to this will have actually been along the Long Las Cymru themselves. That was near Llanidlos in central Wales. I was actually following this book. It's a Cicerone guide written by Richard Barrett. This book is actually written from the perspective of somebody going from the south to the north. And he does make the comment in here, it did make me laugh at the time, that of gentle gradients, I think he refers to. That's certainly not the case if you cycle from north to south, where there was quite some quite strenuous climbing, but the reward, as with all cycling, is in the views that you see. Here was another view, again in mid Wales. The route takes you well away from any kind of traffic, and you can enjoy the Welsh countryside. And as you can see here, this was the day I cycled, the final full day of cycling in Wales when I was heading to Cardiff. and the sun had certainly redeemed itself. Unfortunately, you tend to remember the days when the sun comes out rather than the days where it throws it down all day. And that was a fantastic, the bridge over the River Wye. The best bit is yet to come as I head off over the bridge and look to my right, and there's this beautiful scene of this, I don't know, oak tree perhaps, and the sun climbing behind the tree. A really beautiful morning on the bike. The Wye Valley was again one of the highlights of the trip. I'm not going to say really anything about the trip or the fourth part of the trip down to London. It was fairly standard fare, following the corridor of the M4 really, along canals, and then I eventually arrived in London a few days into September, and I'd achieved my objective of cycling to the 4 capitals of the UK during the COVID summer of 2020. I do, however, just want to point out and say thank you. I know some of them are probably watching this now, to a few of these people who helped me along the way. Rob, who I've already mentioned, Tim, who helped me and guided me and took me on a cycle in the Lake District, Jeff Truman, who joined me one evening at the campsite near Penrith. He brought me a beer and we talked about cycling in North America, I seem to remember. Suzanne Forup, who some of you will know, she works for Cycling UK in Scotland. She's been to the Cycle Touring Festival, and I stayed with her, and she guided me along the John Muir Way, which was fantastic, to the west of Dunbar. Craig came to my rescue. Craig, I know from, he lives not far from me here, but when my phone broke down and I had real technological problems in southwest Scotland, he happened to be there, staying at his in-laws. So Sharon's parents put me up overnight, which was great, and we shared a beer or two. The Warm Showers people, Joe and Kath in North Wales. Now, Paul, who I met up with in Bristol, Paul has an interesting COVID story on his own, because in early 2020, he set off from Tarifa in the south of Spain, just like I'd done in 2015, with the intention of getting to Nordkamp. But unfortunately, he had to abandon his journey when he arrived in France because of the COVID crisis. Hopefully, he'll get the chance to finish that at some point in the future. But it was good to meet up with him after having only contacted with him online before. And then Max and Zoe and Paul, who helped me with various aspects, whether it be coffee, route finding, or giving me somewhere to stay overnight on the way down to London. So thank you to all those people. Now that was a month in effect of cycling crammed into 15 minutes. You can, as part of the festival, watch a film that I made. It's called The Great British Cycle Tour, which gives obviously a lot more detail about the journey that I made. And you can also watch another film that I made back in 2020. I'm not sure whether it's part of the festival or not, but I think after having chased around Britain to the 4 capitals, I really wanted a cycle trip where I wasn't chasing anywhere. So I went up to the youth hostel at Malham and I based myself there, stayed in a camping pod for 3 nights at the end of October. And that was a very, very different trip, a really enjoyable trip, but just pootling around, not going very far, going from one place to the other, and a very different kind of cycle trip. So that might be of interest as well. And don't forget the Cycling Europe podcast. You can listen to the story of Maximilian J. St. George and how he cycled around Europe all those years ago, as well as interviews and bits and pieces with people who are still doing it today. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Perhaps I'll answer some of your questions later.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Always an excellent speaker. Tim, for those of you who don't know, Tim Millikin cycled 46,500 kilometres around the world in 2015 to 18, which is a long way by any measure. He now guides bike trips and runs bushcraft courses, and he's just written a book about his adventures, which is out this month. I'll leave Tim to tell you more about his experiences of cycling during the pandemic, but I think he's got a very interesting story to tell, and it's quite different from Andrew. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Andrew. Right. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll start with some slides. But yeah, I do have a different sort of perspective on the COVID travel, because I was actually working when the whole thing kicked off. So 2020, in the year that touring forgot, my experience personally starts in Africa. So I was working out there for a company called Tour d'Afrique. They are a cycle supported company, and they take people on big adventures all around the world. And I've been working for them for a short while. I'd done one tour of Romania before this, and then they drafted me into the Africa trip in January. So we went there and it was amazing. It was about 40 different cyclists, all planning to cycle from Cairo to Cape Town. This was when we got there on the 9th of January, and we didn't really know anything about COVID at this time. We were in full ignorance mode at that point. We probably heard some rumors of things that were going off in China, but at this point we were just looking forward to the cycling and the trip that would take us from Cairo through Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. So yeah, all these people were really going for it, myself included as a guide. It was a mixed bag. We had some people on the trip who were on their honeymoon. We had people who were 69 or 70. We had young people, old people, a full mix of different ethnicities and clients. It was a really, really fun group to guide. It was a really special trip. And as we started, we'd cycle through Egypt with really no problems, other than the police escorts, which would follow us every day in a truck with machine guns behind us as we cycled, which was a bit annoying. But we had no real problems in terms of COVID as we continued. Egypt was a lot of fun, very hot, but very cold at night. It was January still, but we started at the pyramids and we went through the desert on the way to Sudan. When we got to the first border point with Sudan was when we all first got temperature checked. And this was the first kind of recognition that something was going on, that something different was happening. So a lot of us, everyone had to get temperature checked to get into Sudan. And it was an interesting experience. But no, we didn't really think there was any real issues at that point, because whilst we were in Africa, it felt very, very safe. When you looked at the news, all the coronavirus issues were currently either in China or kind of popping up in the beginnings of Italy at this point. This probably takes us into February. So we thought we were very safe in Africa because it was a thing that was happening over there and wasn't really happening to us. So we continued the tour and we had a lot of fun. So we moved through Sudan and then went into Ethiopia, where again we were temperature checked, and the only issues we had was when I had diarrhea going over the border, and they didn't like the fact that I was white as a ghost, but it wasn't coronavirus. It was only the flu, the bug that was going around before I got on the border. So we went into Ethiopia, and as we started to move down, the coronavirus cases did start to become more prevalent. People started to read the news and more things were happening and more highlights were happening on people's phones, and there was more of a rumbling in camp every night about what was going on. Now, we had a doctor on tour, and she then presented everyone a sort of a fact sheet on coronavirus and what she could find out from speaking to people in England and her friends in the medical world. So people felt pretty safe still as we moved into Kenya. Then things started to become more real. So we had more cases in Europe and more cases in America and Canada. And it just kind of, people were starting to not come who were meant to join us on these legs going south. They didn't feel it was a safe thing to do. So whilst we were continuing going forward, a lot of the clients who were meant to join us actually weren't coming. Now, what is really interesting is once we got into Kenya, not only did our awareness of coronavirus change, but also the people who we met in Africa, relationship to coronavirus change as well as us. So whilst we would often cycle, we'd be called something like Mzungu, which means foreigner. People would then shout at us coronavirus, which was quite upsetting, especially because we didn't really know much about it at the time either. So it was a real interesting kind of insight into sort of the minds of the locals and coronavirus whilst we were still touring at this point. Now this takes us down into Tanzania. Now we'd got into Tanzania, and this was probably beginning of March, and we'd just crossed from Kenya to Tanzania, just about to cycle on the off-road trails towards Zambia. We'd cycled from one day to Babati, and unfortunately we got wind, the border to Zambia was closed. They were not letting anyone through. That tied in with the fact that governments actually started to asked people to go home. The Canadian government, the American government, the British governments were sort of saying, come back home, wherever you are, come back. People on repatriation flights. It was a case in point that a lot of people were talking about it all of the time, but we still felt safe. But when the borders were closed, we knew we couldn't continue the tour. And we had to make the decision, I didn't make the decision, but the TDA made the decision to cancel the tour in Tanzania, unfortunately. So everyone had to fly home. And we spent a week with the clients flying them home and getting their things together. And unfortunately, that was the end. It was March. The pandemic had hit the world and it was time to go back for everyone into the lockdown. So that's what I did. I went back into the lockdown. I went back home. I actually moved back with my parents. I did that for the most of the lockdown. And then I built a camper van and I lived in the camper van because it's a preference to living with my parents. But you know, everyone was scared at that point. In March, the first lockdown, whilst it was sunny, it was still new and everyone was abiding by the rules. And as the lockdown started to release, there was a possibility of going cycling again. And this is something that I didn't want to miss up. So what me and my girlfriend Jo did, we decided to go to France and take a trip in France when we were allowed to in July. Now, this takes us to the second trip of my 2020, and that was the Ardèche-Cévennes Divide. Now, the Ardèche-Cévennes Divide is a bikepacking route developed by bikepacking.com, which is about 330 kilometers of really, really, really hard cycling in South Central France. So on their website, they rate the route as a 6 out of 10. It was an 11 out of 10. It was really, really, really hard. We thought we were very good cyclists. We really struggled from the outset. So traveling in France brought with it its own issues. We had to look up their local guidelines. It was really important that we respect the French rules of the pandemic, as well as the English rules. So we didn't fly, we didn't get a boat, we took the car and we drove from Oxford to the start of the route. So we took the train. So we didn't have to leave the car, we didn't have to go around the villages or was cycling through France. We rode to the start of the route, and it was a bikepacking route, so it was mainly off-road. So we didn't really need to come into contact with anyone. So we were thinking safety first policy at all points. Also in France, what they have is a policy of a different guideline in terms of mask at this point. This was July, and the policy in France at that point was mask on inside, but even as you're walking to your seat in the restaurants, if you step foot into any public property, you've got to wear a mask. And that was something we had to research before we went, so we didn't break any local laws or customs. And that's a very important point, because I guess you have to take a lot of check what you're doing first before you do anything, because you can't just go around touring as you normally would. You have to check the laws and the customs before you go, especially in a pandemic world. So we had our bikepacking routes, and we had, as you can see from my bike, full of stuff. So we were fully self-sufficient. If we needed to break down, if anything happened to us or the bikes, we had first aid kits, we had our tents, our stoves. We had enough tools in there to sink a battleship. I mean, I brought the mole grips just in case we had to get into the bike somehow. Cable cutters, spare brake pads, you name it, we had everything. So we didn't really need to bother any local shops or any local establishments that we didn't have to. So we felt very safe in that respect, and we felt that we were able to ride in France safely. As I said, it was hard though. Like once you're off-road in this region of France, it is not a 6 out of 10. It's up and down over massive rocks and massive boulders. I don't think these pictures show it too well how steep it was, but it was pretty rough. Luckily, we had enough things to be self-sufficient, but whilst, you know, in case anything happened, we were perfectly able to fix it. But luckily, not too much happens other than some flats. And we did get a lot of flats because it was off-road and I didn't have tubeless at the time, but it was a really fun and bumpy route. Now, another thing we did was always wild camping. So a way to sort of restrict our going into establishments, don't rely on campsites, no relying on hotels. It was a wild camping trip. And what that does, it brings us sort of into the nature and onto the trail a lot more and away from things like hotels where we could cause issues with people or just being around. So we're very aware of that at the time. But, you know, it was a really, really good way of actually keeping ourselves on the trail and just being self-sufficient. It took me back to my days when I was cycling around the world and you just had to rely on your wits, and you could just cycle as much as you wanted to, and then you'd stop and you would camp. We did this tour in about a week. It was in July, and then we used like a loop. So we parked the car at one spot, and then we did a loop around to the end. Some people can take a train back, but we decided to do a loop because then we didn't have to go on the train either and mess around with that either. Not for our ease, as well as just going onto the train. Now, one interesting thing about France is that we found that whilst we wanted to leave the car somewhere, we looked at a lot of warm shower sites to wonder if we could leave the car just outside their house, not come in. But I couldn't find anyone at the endpoint who would allow us to do that. So I think things did start to change from my experience of the coronavirus and warm showers and just asking for help. Because it's just, people probably didn't feel very comfortable with strangers, especially from other countries, even at that point when we were allowed to. But it's just a really interesting kind of dichotomy of what happens in people's minds. I don't know how this is going to continue in the future when people want to use warm showers in other countries or in this country. Are they going to feel comfortable having people in their houses? I know Andrew had a good experience, but now into lockdown 3, will that continue? I hope it does, because it's a beautiful thing. But yeah, well, fingers crossed for that one, I guess. So France was a really, really good trip. It was beautiful, that's the thing. It was July in the south of France. So whilst it was good that we played by the rules, it's also good for us and our mental health to get outside and do something that we truly and utterly love. Also, it's kind of supports small businesses. There's a lot of small bakeries and restaurants in France that do rely on the tourism, and they're not getting that at this point. So there is a positive to go and visit these places in July and when you can next, or if you follow the guidelines, because the tourism industry has taken a massive hit. And if you can give them some of your tourist money and come do these things, they need it to recover. So businesses have been hit everywhere in England and in every country. So it's still quite an important thing to go actually and support these people. And yeah, it's just stunningly beautiful. You know, the south central region of Spain is amazing. And once things are allowed again, it's definitely a place worth checking out. Just make sure you set your skill level to 6 out of 10 or 11 out of 10, depends on how you rate yourself. Now, the third trip we did during 2020 was a trip in England, and it's the newly formed Cycling UK King Alfred's Way. It's a route in England, mainly off-road again. So again, really, really COVID friendly. And it starts, it's a loop. So you can kind of start anywhere along that loop. So we chose to start in Goring, and we followed it clockwise, going towards Reading, to Farnborough, across Winchester, and back round to where we started. The interesting about the King Alfred's Way, because it is mostly off-road, we decided this time, it was September, so it could have rained. We took mountain bikes instead of gravel bikes to match our ability to the trails, and also to ensure that we had bikes that were suitable for steep and gravelly descents. Around the South Downs Way, there is some quite steep bits. So by having a bike that was suitable meant we were able to ride within our comfort zone, something we probably couldn't do in France. And then, you know, so if anything happened to us, we weren't putting ourselves at risk or the health service at risk, because they were needed elsewhere. Now, the King Alfred's Way also allows us to stay close to home. Because we were based in Oxford, at any point here, we could have got a train to home. So if one of us did come down with potential any injuries or even some COVID symptoms like a cough or a fever, we could get home very quickly, something that we couldn't do in France. So this was a kind of more COVID-friendly trip. The King Alfred Way, I'm not going to talk too much about because there is a talk on that in the festival for you to check out, but I would recommend the route because it is really, really amazing to see that part of South England. And it's about 330 kilometers, and we did it in 4 days. What we also did, we wild camped throughout the whole thing. So hotels was not that open at the time, so we decided to camp throughout the route. And there's lots of lovely camping spots along the route, because it does take you through some lovely national parks. You're on the South Downs Way, you're in the corner of the New Forest, you're on the Ridgeway up towards Oxford. So there's lots of camping opportunities. Just kind of, because it's only 4 days, you can kind of pick where you start, and then forward that to your camp spot and work out if there's some greenery around for you to wild camp. Now, again, in the King Calvary's way, we were self-sufficient. Again, all the tools in the world, which was needed because I did get a lot of flats. I was on my new mountain bike, which went very, very slowly as compared to my gravel bike. I did nickname it a slug because it went so slow. But it was a really, really amazing route. And you know what, you forget about England, how beautiful it is. So going forward, there's an interesting thing to think. I'm sure a lot of you have cycled around England, but I've never toured in England before. I've rode 46,500 kilometers around the world, but I've never really toured in England. And that's actually quite an amazing thing to do an England tour. And going forward, that's an option for this summer. So if nothing happens work-wise, which I don't think it will, or nothing happens because of the travel restrictions that are in place, then you know, we can still do an England tour potentially this summer, which is quite exciting, and there's lots to see. I'm sure Andrew can vouch for that for his trip, and so can the clients. You know, again, self-sufficiency is a beautiful thing, and that is also just one of the ways that I like to personally tour as well. But going forward, I think the 2020 restrictions were hard, and hopefully this summer things do get better. I think that with the travel restrictions that are coming in, people aren't going to go away if they know that they can't come home or if it's expensive to come home with holiday restrictions. The rollouts of a vaccine is a good thing, I think. So when someone is vaccinated, the travel will open up again. But I feel that once people can go away and actually come home cost-free as well, then they will be they'll be able to tour up more, hopefully in this end of the tour, the end of 2021, sorry. So yeah, for me, it was 3 trips in 2020 from Africa to France to England. And I just hope that going forward, things do open up, and I'm sure that they will. And I'm sure we can all once again get out there and tour safely. Now, before I leave you, I'm just going to show you that my book is now available for pre-order from today on my website, timmillikin.com. And you can jump on there and you can purchase it. And it's a book on the world tour. So I highly recommend you all buy that. And I'm doing a talk on it on the 21st at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Always a pleasure to hear your adventures. Makes me have extremely itchy feet. Super. So we've had a few questions. I know some of the questions have been answered directly by the speakers in the Q&A box, and I think you should all be able to see those if you click on the answered button. But one question that has come in, which I think Andrew's going to tackle, but the others might want to listen to as well, is that how did you ensure that your trip was local? And if your trip wasn't local, can you please add a comment on that?
Yeah, I think you need to bear in mind that I think the trips that we're talking about here took place in summer of 2020, when lockdown 1 had finished, and we were beginning to start, you know, we were allowed to travel again. There were no restrictions on actually traveling around the UK, certainly. I still am, and I was very, very conscious of all the rules and regulations, of making sure that I didn't not just stick to the rules, but also I didn't bend the rules, because I think rules are there to be, you know, for a reason. And I am confident, hand on heart, I can say that I didn't break any rules. In fact, when I got to Northern Ireland, I was thinking that perhaps I might go to Dublin, but then it was a conversation with a chap in a bar I was having breakfast one morning, and he was from Dublin, or he was from the south of the border, and he was talking about the situation down there. And it became fairly apparent that, yes, you could easily cycle over the border, but it wouldn't be a good idea. It would be breaking, well, it would be certainly bending the rules. And I'm confident that throughout that summer, I stuck not just to the spirit of the law, but to the letter of the law as well. And you're a lawyer, so...
Oh, not got any expertise in coronavirus rules, I'm afraid. So there's no other question. I think one more question has just popped up. Somebody has asked about Tim's bike and whether you think cycling Africa is possible with a mountain bike without suspension.
100%. In fact, I wouldn't recommend suspension for most of Africa because there's actually loads of paved roads going through, at least from Cairo to Tanzania. That area you can go completely on a road bike if you wish to. So don't let your bike selection put you off Africa at all. There's lots of different routes you could take. You could choose a mountain bike, but don't feel you need one if you don't have one. I had a touring bike, like a steel frame with aluminium frame with carbon forks, and it was perfect for the trip over there. Just get bigger tires for the off-road bits if you need it.
So the one question I think we will take is what are the presenters' favourite ever rides? What was your favourite ever tour?
I think if I were to set off tomorrow and I could, I would head back to Denmark. I think it was it was just an easy place to cycle. It was flat-ish. There were lots of campsites. You were welcomed as a cyclist. It was interesting. I think, yeah, Denmark, it wasn't spectacular, but it was just it was almost like, it was like cycling in a film. It's cycling as it should be. There were no real challenges. You could just kind of sit back and enjoy the scenery. And yeah, no, I think I'd head back to Denmark.
Super. Yeah, I would second that. It's a lovely country to ride in, isn't it? I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, if I may, because a question has just come in, which I think you might have a view on, which is looking at COVID in the developing world. Given your experience, like 21, do you think that's going to be a possibility?
COVID in the developing world, yes. Do you know what? It's really interesting because Africa, in terms of statistics, haven't really been hit, and I feel that potentially the malaria drugs might actually give them some kind of benefits. I don't know if that's true. That's just a theory, but I feel that there is still opportunities to go touring in the developing world once things are safe. Potentially, once you've got the vaccines, maybe then you make sure you're not spreading things to other people where potentially the health risks are increased because they haven't got the same hospital care that we have over here. I also feel that it's an amazing place to go. Just wait until you can. There's no rush. These places aren't going to go anywhere. And it's a really important thing to take away is that you can still go to these places in 2023, 2024. If they're not going to go. So just wait until the health places are better and then go touring, I guess is my point on that one.
Super. Yeah, I think that's probably wise advice. Okay, so I think there are some other questions there, but I think some of them are quite specific ones for the individual speakers. So perhaps if the speakers want to tackle those themselves, but otherwise I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us. It's been a super session. I appreciate it's run over slightly, but it was great to hear from everybody and to launch the festival with such brilliant speakers. Thank you, everybody, and good night.